Blessed are the carpenters, and everyone who understands the importance of measuring twice and cutting once. If you want everything cut to the right length, you'd better double check before you cut. You can't add a bit back on afterwards if you made a mistake. If you want your miter cuts to match up right, you'd better check your angles line up one more time before you bring that saw blade down. What are vertices? What's a vertex? A triangle has 3, a rectangle has 4. They're the points where the sides of a shape meet, forming the angle between them. They're the corners of a room where the walls meet. If you don't want everything to be crooked, you make sure they meet at 90 degrees. You verify your vertices, and if your angles are good, you call them right angles. The vertex of a roof is the highest point where 2 sides meet. It's the pinnacle. Vertex is actually the Latin word for summit. It rests on everything else. If your foundation isn't level, if the structure you build on it is not right, the summation that rests upon it all will not be true. Now, what I want to talk about is the corruption of science. In my lifetime, I have seen science change from something which held as its highest principle that all knowledge must come from an honest process of careful investigation, scrupulous record keeping of all information gathered, which would be available for thorough scrutiny by anyone, with testable hypotheses which would be subjected to rigorous examination, and results which would be cross-compared for consistency with all other known information, to something which has been walled off, made proprietary, the exclusive domain of only those people who have been deemed worthy by a small group of corporations who've decided that they have the monopoly on truth and the discernment of it. Indeed, they have declared that those of us outside of their privileged circle shouldn't even be looking at their science anymore. Oh, we're not fit to question it, and should not attempt to do so, according to them. They say, it's too esoteric for anyone in the normal population to be able to understand or handle with the critical thinking we were taught, as though thinking is something we needed to be taught how to do, rather than an ability we were born with, something innate which we developed throughout our own lives and experience. They have the audacity to tell us we are simply incapable of understanding it, and we should just listen and believe their appointed experts. And many people seem to be perfectly fine with this insult to their intelligence. Science seems to have become a religion now, with vast numbers of people willing to worship at its altar. And if science is now a religion, then what has become of traditional religion? Well, like old software, it seems to have been relegated, deprecated, nearing end of life. Maybe it will be something that will be supported for backwards compatibility for a while in a limited sense, but ultimately phased out. The Pope himself seems to have already abandoned the faith he is supposed to lead, welcoming in other religions, as though Christianity as a distinct religion doesn't really matter anymore. He seems to have had a conversion himself to this new religion, advising us to place our faith in the scientists to lead us into the future. Now it is science that is infallible, and if you don't agree, you will be excommunicated. We are told to trust in whatever the scientists may say, and to do whatever we are told in just the same manner as decrees from the pulpit. If science is no longer falsifiable, then what is it but religious dogma? If a scientist is now someone who tells you what to believe, then how could you differentiate between him and a priest? Why not just put the scientist in the garb of a priest? What's the difference anymore? Unquestionable faith, up until very recently, was something which was demanded only by the most insecure of religions. Perhaps a generation ago, people rightly resented all the intrusions into their personal affairs by the religious institutions and asserted their right to determine how to run their own lives. They rightly questioned the moral authority of the priests and the motives of the church to whom they were beholden. Who were they to tell them how to conduct their lives, especially since it became horrifically clear what they were up to in their sacristies and seminaries? Yet now, like so many freedoms hard won, these freedoms have been so quickly given away again to something which behaves just the same or worse, yet masquerades under a different name. I ask you, if a rose by any other name would smell as sweet, then isn't the smell of something rotten just as obvious no matter what you call it? Incredibly, it seems that so many people have been trained to ignore their own senses. Now, I think many people read the story of doubting Thomas and take a lesson from it like, oh, look how silly he was for not believing Jesus had risen from the dead. But he was proved wrong, wasn't he, when he looked for evidence that it was really him by sticking his fingers in his side? Why did he have to question him? Why didn't he just take his word for it, instead of insisting on verifying it for himself? I mean, he should have just believed him anyway. Then he could have saved himself some embarrassment, couldn't he? Now, I don't know if that story was really meant to put across the idea that anyone who questions what they are told is a fool. Even if that wasn't the original intent, the way the story is framed and what was implied to impressionable young children by the priests and elders was that he was being naughty somehow, causing trouble, a bit of a troublemaker, not behaving properly, being disrespectful to Jesus even, and that he should have just taken him at his word, no questions asked. Even though what he was being asked to believe, that Jesus had been killed and somehow risen from the dead, a first for any human being, for anyone who has walked the earth that looks like a human being at least anyway, was highly incredible, to say the least. Now, even with something as unprecedented as that, he might have believed him based on trust, built up with him over a long time, and from everything he had known about his character. But what he was trying to establish in the first place was whether or not this really was the man he had known and trusted. Even if he could establish that, would he not be right to have any follow-up questions? Should he not be allowed to examine the possibility that maybe Jesus hadn't actually died but had come so close that he was written off as dead and recovered enough to walk and talk in the meantime? Would there be something wrong with him if he considered any theories of a possible long con where an individual works to gain his trust over a long period of time just to pull off a single large deception in order to achieve an outcome that he isn't aware of and is so large in scope that he can't fully encompass? Or would it make him a paranoid and crazy individual for having any further thoughts about the matter? Now, even if the lesson that they were trying to instill in young minds was, don't doubt those you have learned to trust, and don't ask to see proof because you're only going to end up looking foolish if you do, I had thought that maybe this story might have been as likely to be counter-effective to their intentions. I mean, if every other child was as disrespectful and as rebellious as I was, then shouldn't they also have been thinking through the implications of what was really being suggested to us? Maybe some were, maybe some weren't. But I suppose for me, one of the most painful lessons in life has been never to assume what goes on in someone else's head, how they arrive at their conclusions and what thought processes led them there. Even to assume that people have any solid conclusions about anything, or that there are any logical processes to follow, is likely just another example of my own foolish projections. Maybe a lot of people did once question everything they were told, but have learned that life goes easier when you just believe what you're told. Far from blind faith and unquestioning belief, I believe we were born with minds of our own, and that if God gave us minds of our own, then wouldn't He wants us to use them. I mean, if he gave us free will, as they told us he did, wouldn't it be a sin not to exercise it? Making your own decisions, deciding for yourself what is right and wrong, figuring out the truth of it for yourself. Well, isn't that the difference between a human being and a programmed robot? I think Jesus appreciated that. I think he thought that Thomas was absolutely right to ask for proof, as he should have. He was right to trust, but verify, as Ronald Reagan was fond of saying to Mikhail Gorbachev during their negotiations in the 1980s. So we all have to ask ourselves, what am I being shown here? Does it withstand scrutiny? Does it hold up under examination? Does it measure up to some reference point that I already know? How does it compare to what I've seen before? Now, these are the kind of questions that science says to ask. So why now does it preach the opposite? It used to be about questioning everything. So why now is it about questioning nothing? Well, it's obvious, isn't it? It's because the same type of people who used religion to control others have wormed their way into the institutions of science. They don't care for its intended purpose, but for its credentials. In that they figured out that if people have adopted technology as their god, then they will be more willing to believe a scientist than a priest. And so they have taken on the perceived authority of science as a cover for their own purposes. The appearance of solid institutions hides their activities, but under the surface they have been eating it from the inside and gradually hollowed it out, leaving only a facade. And indeed, that is something I have noticed very keenly over the years in my experience working inside some very impressive buildings for some very renowned corporations with very authoritative looking logos. But on the inside, there is absolutely nothing of substance whatsoever. Now, this speaks to the nature of the cloak that something wears. Is that the thing that it is? The skin that it covers itself with? The outward exterior, or what lies beneath? Where is the truth of the matter? Because we've often heard, haven't we, that beauty is only skin deep. Well, why is that? Because truth is beauty, and the true nature of something is to be found in the heart, whatever is at its core. Which I think explains why cœur, or cœur, spelled C-O-E-U-R, is the French for heart. Sacré-Cœur is the Sacred Heart. So I think there's a lot of people now who think science is either amazing or terrible. But really science as a word or a label is neither good nor bad. It's only really what people do under the cover of its name that can be described in such terms. It's the practice of science which has been perverted. What does it mean for something to be perverted? Well, we take it to mean that it's been somehow corrupted. And what literally is a perversion? Well, it's turning it around from the normal or original position. Like perimeter or perimeter is a measuring line that goes around an area. Around, So if you pervert the truth, you're twisting it. Those kind of lies can be a bit more clever, a bit harder to nail down, because they're constructed from something that might look very like truth to the casual eye, but it is malformed or misshapen in a subtle way, which may only be apparent when you examine it in detail. But even if you invert the truth, you turn it on itself or upside down, it still can look like the truth, but misused or misapplied somehow. A screw turned anti-clockwise will dismantle instead of construct. If a roof is turned upside down, its function becomes the opposite of what it is intended to be. The vertex is turned down, the summit is now the lowest point, the apex is now a trough. What once protected everything below it now destroys the whole house. And just the same, science now behaves in practically the opposite way that it once did. What used to be slow and cautious is now urgent and insistent. What was once eager to serve now wants to rule. And what was always mindful of its responsibility to behave rationally and ethically and held itself to the highest of standards is now exempt from the consequences of its actions. What was once scrupulously honest in its pursuit of truth has now totally sold its integrity. There's no ethos holding the institution of science together. There's nothing at the heart of the structure anymore. And with nothing at its core to guide it anymore, the path that science was on has simply been diverted. And with it goes our humanity.